Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Before we get to my interview with China expert Robert Sutter, just a brief reminder, folks, if you haven't yet filled out the Libsyn survey, Politics Guys survey, it would be really helpful if you did. I promise you it will take you 30 seconds, maybe a minute if you've got slow thumbs and you're doing it on your phone, which you probably will, but it would be a big help to us. And again, to find that, it's survey.libsyn.com/politicsguys. That's Libsyn, Libsyn. And I will also have that URL in the show notes. Thanks very much. My guest today is Dr. Robert Sutter, a professor of international affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University. Dr. Sutter has worked both in government and in academia, including positions with the CIA, State Department, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's published 20 books, over 200 articles, and several hundred government reports dealing with contemporary East Asian and Pacific countries and their relations with the United States. Dr. Sutter, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You've been studying China for a long time now, which I think gives you a depth of knowledge and a perspective that's, well, sometimes in some media accounts can be lacking, I think. And so I'd like to start with a little bit of historical context about the United States' relationship with China. For most of the post-World War II era, I think Americans saw the Soviet Union as the primary strategic rival. And there was some concern about Japan, we could see starting in the 1980s. But really in the 21st century, I think it's China that's generally been seen as the main rival to the United States. So could you talk a little bit about how that happened?
I think it's a matter of power. China has become a very powerful country. It has ambitions that are not in line with U.S. interests. Those are long-standing. You talked about the past. I go back a bit, and so when you do that, you find periods when the United States looked at China with intense hostility. It really wasn't so long ago that we looked at Mao Zedong in the way that we often looked at the leaders of North Korea today. A very dangerous country. And they got nuclear weapons in 1964, and this was alarming to the United States. Unclassified documents, declassified documents, show that Robert Kennedy, during the Kennedy administration, was considering striking at China to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons. So this is the kind of attitude we had toward China at that time. It passed with Nixon's opening, but things were not benevolent at all. There were hundreds of thousands of Chinese serving in Vietnam during the war. And so Americans knew that and were worried about it. And so the record is a little mixed. But the basic point, I think, is that the reason we're concerned about China today is that it is so powerful it seems so powerful in a variety of different ways. And it seems intent on challenging the United States in a whole range of areas.
Now, it seems to me that a lot of this, in some can be linked to China becoming part of the World Economic Community with getting into the WTO, and that was, I believe, 2001, I think. And from
Correct.
that point on, when I take a look at charts of Chinese economic growth rates, it's essentially almost flatline. And then in the early 21st century, things really start to take off, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Well, the takeoff began in the early 1990s, actually, and they've been growing average 10% a year since the early 1990s. But we noticed it a lot more after WTO because they traded a lot more. And so in that period, in that first decade, their growth rate was over 10% a year, and their trade growth was over 20% a year.
Wow. And so those numbers, sometimes people will see numbers coming from more closed societies and say, well, wait a second, can we trust those numbers? Do you have any sense about whether that economic data is reasonably accurate?
I think it's reasonably accurate. I mean, there are obviously things that are changed in one way or another over the years, but I think the economists look at this, and in general, they think this is in line with what they think is going on. The World Bank and the IMF look at this pretty carefully, and they're in line with this. I don't have grave doubts about these figures. And the demonstration of this is in China itself. They've just remade all the major cities of China. They're just totally different than what they were.
There's a lot of concern. I mean, President Trump, among others, actually, is very concerned about our trade deficit with China. And of course, China is the main foreign holder of U.S. debt. I just looked it up at the Treasury Department, I think $1.17 trillion. And Japan is kind of right around there at about $1 trillion.
Right.
China's GDP growth, even though it's been down recently, it still looks to me around 6 to 7%, which is around 3 times or so what U.S. GDP growth has been lately. So it makes me wonder, how serious of an economic threat does China pose to the United States, in your view?
Well, I think it does pose a threat to the United States if it follows through on its desires, on its intentions that are challenging the United States. I think growth itself is not a big problem at all. It's the way the Chinese carry out their economic behavior that's gotten the attention of the United States. And now we have reached a point where China is very competitive with the highest end technology type of industries and enterprises of the United States. And according to the U.S. government, at least, they view this as a fundamental national security threat. This is in the Trump administration's national security strategy. They see this as emblematic of China taking control of the high-end industries that the United States relies on for international leadership. And if that happens, China will dominate those industries and, by the logic of this report, will dominate international affairs. And this is not what they want to see. So the danger isn't so much the trade deficit. The danger is how the Chinese are funneling these reserves and what they're doing with them. Really, it's a technology type of issue rather than a trade deficit type of issue.
Is it? That sounds to me like the assumption is that this is, at least in this area, sort of a zero-sum game where there.
Yes.
I mean, is that a reasonable way to look at it? Because there are some who would say, well, international trade doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, and our relationship with China doesn't have to follow that one wins, one loses type of idea.
I think what one needs to do in that situation is just look at the behavior of the government that you're talking about. And if you see the government practicing this zero-sum type of competition, then you have something to worry about. And I think in the case of China, the government is correct in looking at China in a way that says this could be a very well. They look at China as predatory. Is the way they look at it. In this regard, and I think that's accurate. They want to be dominant in these areas. Whether they are or not is not, I can't tell. But the intent, I think, is pretty clear. And once they're dominant, well, how will they treat you? Well, the logic goes a little further. If you're critical of China, you say, well, how do they treat their people? How do they treat their neighbors with whom they have disputes? That's how you'll be treated. And so the U.S. government says we don't want that.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's another way to look at this, though. I mean, there are some people who say, my gosh, China just seems to be this unstoppable force. But it seems to me there are at least a couple of factors that maybe push back against that. Number one, China has some pretty serious problems with corruption, according to the various groups. And even though their GDP has gone up considerably. I mean, when we take a look at GDP per capita, China is somewhere in the 70s worldwide. I mean, it's well behind Western Europe and the U.S. and Japan. And so I wonder, how much do you think corruption and poverty are to China's continued emergence as a world economic power?
I think you've put your finger on two very important elements that need to be dealt with when one considers how powerful China actually is. In my judgment, this and several other factors make the Chinese leaders very internally preoccupied. They deal with their hold on power. They look powerful, but their hold on power doesn't have any inherent legitimacy other than good performance. And if they don't perform well, if they have a big problem of one sort or another, they may be in some difficulty. And so they worry about this internal security. They spend so much on internal security. They spend a lot on their national defense, but they spend more on internal security, trying to keep tabs of their people and so forth, because of they feel very insecure and they need to do this. So this is a drag on their economy. It's a drag on their leadership, and there are many other aspects that you can look at. And I guess one point that we may come when we start talking about economics, we'll come to this at some point, is that the Chinese are following a model that we've seen before. This is the Japan model. This is the Taiwan, South Korea, and others used it, and China is using it. But it reaches a point of diminishing returns. And when it does, if you're not careful, you become like Japan. And Japan really hasn't grown at all significantly since the 1990s. And it was growing 10% a year for quite a while, but it's not anymore. And the Chinese face that because they're following the same model, and it reaches a point of diminishing returns.
Yeah, I wanted to actually let's talk about that a little bit, and
Okay.
that export-driven model. And if I understand it correctly, what that essentially means is to kind of rebalance. They'd need to open up a lot more to imports, and they'd need to actually lower prices in their domestic market. So by being export-driven, correct, it's sort of more difficult for their native population there, but it's easier for exports. And after a certain point, I would imagine, as the Chinese middle class grows, there are going to be a lot more people who are a lot more interested in consumer goods and that sort of thing. And so that seems to me to be a pretty tricky transition. Yes.
It is. It is. And I think what they have to do, and I'm not an economist, and so I'm going to give you a non-economist explanation of this, but I certainly watched Japan and how they did it. And looking at China, they have to build up a domestic consumption. Now, they can do this with the wealthy middle class, but there's so many constraints on this because the Chinese don't have an effective pension system. They don't have an effective, even their schooling has to be paid for in a variety of ways, and they don't have an effective healthcare system. And so people have to save for these sorts of things because if they need it for schooling or healthcare or pensions, they have to have it on their own. And so to do that, they save. And yet the saving rate, the interest rate that people get in China is well below the market rate. The government, this is where all the capital that gets poured into state-owned enterprises in China comes from, is the fact that the government basically takes this profit because they pay low interest rates to the people, the depositors. They don't even keep pace with their cost of living. And they use that money for all these enterprises, funneling the money into it in a way that will compete with the United States. And so, but if you do that, you don't have a domestic consumption base. The people don't have the money to buy the things that you want them to buy, to have a domestically driven economy. And that's where they're at. And they haven't been able to change that very well. They have a whole series of plans beginning in 2013, but they really haven't done it very much at all because it changes the way it changes interest. There are interests that are involved in perpetuating this system. And so for now, the Japanese model is perpetuated in China, which is bad for them over the long term, and they know it, but they can't seem to change it.
In terms of the sort of the mechanism to changing this, I mean, I know that recently, well, at least it seems like to me that Xi Jinping has essentially kind of tried to set himself up to be, well, I don't know if you call it the dictator is too strong, but maybe. And I think some people would say, well, this makes sense in a way because it will allow the government to take sort of the steps it needs to take without having to worry about a lot of popular blowback, like in a democracy, and pursue these kind
Yeah.
of, longer term strategies. But on the other hand, I'm wondering if it makes them too inflexible to do certain things like that. Well, what do you think about that?
My thought is the main issue seems to be among the elite, among the leaders. In other words, do you follow this other model, but that would undermine the interest of certain leaders in the administration, in the government, in the party, and the result is there's resistance and passive or otherwise to moving in this direction. Now, Xi Jinping himself he seems to be very much a control guy. He wants to control things. Well, if you want to control things, then you keep the money in these state-owned enterprises. You sustain the existing system, and that means you don't do these economic reforms, which would be free up the market and give more leeway to free enterprise and so forth. And so my sense is, yes, he has more control because he can stay in longer. And yes, he is a powerful figure, but is he moving in the right direction in this regard? I think he gives a premium to control, party control, and not to market-driven economic growth. And he needs more market-driven economic growth.
Right. I've read stories from time to time about how he's trying to cut down, to crack down on corruption and so forth. And whenever I see these stories, I wonder, is this actually an anti-corruption move, or is this a way to consolidate power and take out his rivals and that sort of thing? Or maybe it's some combination of the two. I mean, could you talk a little bit about the corruption problem and how it's maybe being used?
I think the corruption problem has been, as you noted in your earlier question, it is a serious problem. It is a serious preoccupation. It's a serious problem in a lot of countries. In the United States, we have some corruption, but if we don't interact with these other countries, you don't get a sense of how bad it is in so many other places. And it is pretty bad all over the world. And China is no exception. It's just it has a very widespread corruption. And they are trying to do something about it, and he's actually doing quite a bit. But in the process, as you say, he's using this weapon to intimidate his colleagues in the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. And this means that you just don't cross Mr. Xi Jinping. Otherwise, you'll be investigated for corruption, and you probably have some in your background because the system seems to have an awful lot of corruption. I think it'd be very hard to be a senior leader in China and not have some corruption in your background.
And do you think that that just is inherent in the type of government that they have, or is it maybe in part a question of the fact that China is so large and I would imagine difficult to govern and monitor, at least in especially outlying areas, or some combination of those things?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think it's certainly a feature of the system because you depend on your evaluations from your supervisors. You don't have a recourse easily in the courts or something for an injustice that's done to you. So you need to get along within the system. And to get along within the system, to get your promotion and get your recognition and so forth, you've got to make sure that the people that you work for are very happy with you. And that leads to corruption. And it becomes, and it's an old feature of China with the Manchu dynasty and the previous dynasties. They had an awful lot of corruption too, and so it was a sort of systematic of the society, and so that's a feature that hasn't gone away, and it comes back, and that's where they are with it. So it helps explain why it continues and why it has become so pervasive, and you just don't have public oversight. You don't have a media that can really go after this. They do have some leeway in China to go after corruption now, but in general, you didn't have this, and you just don't have this sense that the government is responsible to the people. The government is basically responsible to the party. And the party is the people, at least in the context of an American. What is the ultimate source of authority? Well, in China, it's really the party and the members of the party. It's not the people per se. So you as an individual, you can make charges against corruption, but it's really hard to get recourse in any way similar to what you could do, say, in a country like the United States.
Well, it seems to me then that that's a fundamental difference between, say, China and countries like South Korea and Japan, who pursued a sort of a similar economic growth patterns. In South Korea and Japan, there was some established rule of law, and people could believe that the system, would work for them if they raised a complaint or so forth. And China would need to move in that direction as well, right? If they wanted to open up their markets and make those kind of economic system changes as well.
I guess so. I wouldn't exaggerate the absence of corruption in places like South Korea and Japan, particularly in the past. These large enterprises that had big control and influence in the government. I'm not sure how you would characterize this, but there was sort of the one hand was doing it was patting the back of the one partner and the other partner. The government and the companies, the very large companies, were together, and so the president of Samsung, he was indicted recently for corruption, and I think this happens in these kinds of systems. Yes. So I don't think it's China's not alone, but it has I think it has a worse problem, and it's corrupt not only in the business side, but it's corrupt in a lot of other administrative sides as well.
Intellectual property or theft of intellectual property has been a big issue lately with China. There are some people who say it costs hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and I'm wondering. So I'm assuming that the Chinese government, if they wanted to crack down on this, they certainly could. And the fact that they're not cracking down on this means that they don't feel that they necessarily need to. And if I understand it correctly, it's not just stealing trade secrets, but maybe even more troublesome, some would say, is forcing companies to reveal trade secrets in order to get access to China's market.
Yes, sir. That is a very big issue, and it's right at the center of the current debate about China in Washington. And so it's a this has been going on for so long. We had agreements with China to stop intellectual property rights beginning in the early 1990s. U.S. and China have had agreements where the Chinese would do this, and of course they never did. And to get into the WTO, the U.S. was the leading negotiator in getting China into the WTO, and the U.S. set up a whole series of articles in the agreement that required adherence to intellectual property rights and so forth, and it just doesn't happen. And now the Chinese have moved from just producing fake Mickey Mouse shirts to something that's really extraordinary, where of course, the cybersecurity was a big issue for Barack Obama. President Obama was very discreet in how he talked about China until the last 2 years of his government. But then by that time, he was so angry with China that he would speak out publicly maybe once a week about one thing or another. And probably the issue he spoke out most about was China's cyber theft of U.S. Business secrets. We have now reached a point where the Chinese still do this theft and intellectual property, but now they're using their foreign exchange reserves to purchase advanced American companies. And with those purchases, they will get what they need to set up the dominant industries in these high technology sectors that the U.S. government fears will happen. And so this is the latest phase and probably the most serious. And this is why of this kind of development. And this is why the U.S. government seems to be very anxious in stopping this. And I think that's a big feature of U.S.-China economic relations today.
But it would seem to me that just even though the U.S. is by far the world's largest economy, that acting alone, that would be sort of difficult, whether it's through tariffs or various other things that the administration has, suggested. That this
Hmm.
is the sort of thing that calls for multilateral pressure, working with a lot of our allies, as opposed to just being some sort of a unilateral type of thing that the United States does on its own.
You're probably right, but it's got to start someplace. And if somebody doesn't do it, and of course, there's a lot of pain that goes into this type of effort, and the Chinese will retaliate in a whole range of ways. And so this is a big danger for your economy. But the U.S. has defined this now, as the U.S. government has defined this as a national security issue. And when you do that, it looks much more serious. If you say we will be dominated, is the way that it's portrayed in the Trump administration's national security strategy. We will be dominated by China, and so that's a very serious outcome. And so the U.S., I think, whether with partners or without, I think is probably going to do something on to restrict China's ability. Is already doing it actually to restrict China's ability to take over these companies, and will restrict other things that will not that will seen as enhancing China's headlong advance into these industrial areas that and high technology areas that if they gets the dominant position, this is seen as very serious for U.S. national security.
And I would think that this isn't just a U.S. issue, but China, I mean, other countries, I'm sure South Korea and Japan, and really countries around the world would be concerned about that. And at some point, you would think there would be enough concern where they could put enough international pressure on China to force it to modify some of these policies.
Yes, except that you have to look at it from the point of view of the companies. The companies, what do they want? Well, they don't want to lose their technological edge, but at the same time, they want access to the Chinese market. So there's a lot of complaints. They talk about the complaints that they have with China's the Chinese industrial policy and so forth. But at the end of the day, they're deeply involved with China, and they make a big profit in China. And so this is where company loyalty and national loyalty can get mixed up. And so politically, where do they stand? Well, let's take a look. We'll see when we have this pressure. We're going to have this. We're already having this discussion in Washington, and I think it's going to get more intense. And we'll see where they line up because they're. I mean, if you work for a company,
Sure.
your loyalty is to the stockholders,
Yep,
and so
absolutely.
it's a very very different sort of mindset.
That's a good point. I also like to ask you about China in Africa. From what I've heard, China has been investing very heavily in Africa, much more so, at least it seems to me, than the United States or really any other country that I know of. And I guess I'm wondering, first off, is that correct? And if it is, why are they focusing so much on Africa?
It's not really correct,
Okay.
and they are focusing there because of the main push began about 20 years ago. They need resources. The Chinese economy is very resource intensive, uh, and it was very wasteful. It's changed to become more efficient, but in 2010, China used 4 times the amount of oil to advance its economy a certain level than did the United States, and we're not that good about being efficient in using oil, and they use 4 times as much. And so it was just outrageous. And so they had a supply side answer, which is to get all this raw materials from places like Africa. And so they went out. The government promoted this policy, and so they invested in various places to get access to various commodities, including oil. And of course, they try to balance it by encouraging trade, and trade takes place, and traders come from China. So by 2010, 2012, there were 1 million Chinese in Africa selling stuff and working on projects and so forth. And they give it a lot of publicity. So whenever a Chinese leader will go to these places, they'll talk about this commitment and that commitment, and deals after deals worth billions of dollars. And unfortunately, a lot of it never happens. There are very few people that look at this in detail. There's no detailed study of this. So people like me, you have to be sort of nerdy and look through the data, and I do, and there are just countless ones that never get finished. And so the economists, they have a good economic intelligence unit. They looked at China's investment in Africa pretty thoroughly up to 2015. And they said in 2015, 5% of the foreign investment in Africa came from China. 5% is not dominant.
No, not hardly.
And others in Latin America saw the same pattern, at 5%. In Asia, the countries around Asia, if you look at the Southeast Asian countries, a lot of talk about this, billions of this, billions of that, billions of the other thing. In 2015, 2016, even more recently, it's about 10% if you include Hong Kong. So China and Hong Kong account for about 10% of the foreign investment in ASEAN countries, in the Southeast Asian countries. So it's not that overwhelming. They do a lot of infrastructure work. They make big shiny things that show up in capital cities. We're seeing a lot of this discussion, say, in the Philippines. Now they're trying to win over the Philippines government, and here in the Philippines, Japan is still the leading foreign investor in the Philippines, surpassing China, and dealing with infrastructure, which China is very good at. So at the end of the day, I think what you have is that China is a new player. It's a big new player in all of these international venues as an investor, as a builder of infrastructure, and financier. It's a big player. But dominant, I don't see it. I'm not sure where it's dominant.
Interesting.
It's certainly not in Africa.
Oh, interesting. Let's talk a little bit about China as a growing military power. I mean, of course, the United States still spends a lot more than any other country. I mean, a lot more. But according to the most recent stats I've seen, China is second in the world.
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is, and it's a healthy second.
Yeah.
There's nobody near it, except from
What are China's military objectives? And I guess more importantly for the United States, to what extent do you see them clashing with U.S. objectives?
Well, I think the Chinese objectives focus around the rim of China. That's their national security area of most concern. They do have concerns about sea lines of communication and trade, securing those over the longer term. But that'll be a longer-term process. They're not going to be in a position to do too much about that very quickly, and they're not crashing and doing it. So they're building up their Navy, and maybe in 10 years they'll have a Navy that can help them a lot in the Middle East and so forth to secure their sea lines of communication. But right now, and this has been the case for some time, they can't do that. They're under the control of other countries, particularly the United States, and India is there, and so forth. So it's really around the rim of China that you see the problems, and here they boil down to they want better security around their periphery, and this security is challenged by these other powers. But individually, these powers really aren't too serious a challenge for China. The main problem is that the United States backs these powers, and the United States has a big presence around the rim of China. And so the U.S. So that's where we're seeing the rub. It's right around the eastern and southern rim of China, where you see this tension, with the Chinese wanting the U.S. to back off, to go back, and the Americans saying, if we go back, our allied structure in the region will diminish and probably end. And we don't know what this outcome will be, except that it will be in Asia, probably dominated by China. And in Asia dominated by China is something that the United States has this view on, in my judgment, historically. And that is the United States doesn't want a big power to dominate Asia, that if this power is hostile to the United States. We learned this lesson in Pearl Harbor with Japan, and we didn't want this to repeat itself. And so in the Cold War, we had this containment system in Asia to prevent this from happening. And at the end of the day, that was successful. We won the Cold War. But now China has emerged as a country that doesn't like this U.S. security presence around its rim. It never has liked it, but now they're powerful enough to challenge it, and that's the rub right now.
Well, now, of course, there are some people who might say, well, isn't this kind of a lot like what the United States did in the 19th century in its own backyard, essentially making itself the dominant power in the Americas? And I'm wondering, is this in kind of the Chinese version of the Monroe Doctrine?
They say it isn't, but it is, I think. Yes, I think it's accurate. And that was the period of imperialism, and so and colonialism. And so, if that's the kind of order you want to see in Asia, well, then you'll like it very much.
Right, right.
But my sense is that doesn't work with the reality of the countries in the region. China is surrounded by countries that don't want to be dominated by anybody, and these countries are friends and close partners of the United States, and have been for a long, long time. And so, should the U.S. just say, well, we just have to accommodate ourselves to China's dominance of our friends and allies and so forth? And that's the question we have to ask ourselves.
And I guess another difference is to the U.S. in the 19th century is in that region, there are a number of other countries who are pretty significant economic powers in their own right.
Of course, yeah, and they're pretty good militarily too, but that's yes, and so the idea that somehow you have this China-centered view of Asia doesn't make sense to people like me and others who are Asian specialists who say, well, wait a minute, we have all these interests with Japan and Vietnam and the Southeast Asian countries and Taiwan and India, and we just should say we should just say, well, that doesn't matter anymore. And this is all the more hard in the United States because we're no longer a Eurocentric country. The United States is trained. You may not see this where you live, but boy, you see it where I live, and you see it most places in the United States, where in my lifetime, America has become a country with a big portion of Asians because of our immigration policy, which we changed in the mid-'60s. And so we have millions of Asians in this country who are, very vibrant. I don't want to idealize this, but generally they become very vibrant and active in the society in the United States, and they have very close ties with Asia. We can't go home. The Yankee can't go home because we're so integrated now that this just makes it, I think, impossible for us to pull away. And so the upshot is we're going to be around, and it's a big issue, and we have to manage. And it's a big source of tension, and how we manage this is going to be very important.
Speaking of big sources of tension, I have to ask you about China's relationship with North Korea. Now, as I understand it, China is pretty much the key global supporter of the Kim regime. I mean, without them, it's hard to imagine them being in power. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why they have decided to support North Korea in the way that they do, and they have for many years now.
It's a good question, and they go back and forth. The elites in China go back and forth in looking at North Korea as a liability, and then looking at it as an asset, and so they have a lot of active debate. But at the end of the day, the elite, the government, the people in charge in China want to keep a stable relationship with North Korea. The alternatives are worse for them. Keep in mind that the North Koreans don't like China. North Korean negotiators always talk to Americans about China not always, but repeatedly do this in a disparaging way. They want to deal with the United States because they hate the Chinese, is what they'll tell you.
Wow.
Now that's coming from the North Koreans, and they're not terribly trustworthy people,
Right.
and these negotiators. But nonetheless, that's what happens, and the Chinese know this, and so they have this very awkward relationship with North Korea. But they need it. They need that stability. The alternative is for them is a unified Korea where the U.S. would have a strong military presence in the peninsula, and this would be very bad for China. strategically. They want the U.S. They want things to go the other way. They want the U.S. To get out of the region, and they want to foster that if they can. And so this is not their strategic goal now. So they don't want North Korea to collapse, and they don't want North Korea to be a big nuclear danger. But that's secondary for them. It's not the high priority that it has with the United States. And so we've had this difference with China for a long time. Now we're in a very fluid situation on the Korean Peninsula, and so all actors, the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Americans and the Chinese are all working in a very different way in this very seemingly optimistic time, trying to figure out their interest and adjust their concerns. But at the end of the day, the Chinese will look for as much stability on the peninsula as they can.
But of course, I guess they're sort of stuck with the Kims, and it seems when we're talking about stability, I mean, I don't know exactly how stable any of the Kims really have been. Maybe the first generation a little more so, but I would guess that, or maybe not. Would they prefer North Korea that was stable but ruled by someone who's a little less, I don't know, unstable, if that's the right way to look at it?
Much less provocative. They would like a North Korea. I think the specialists that look at this say they would like a North Korea that would be like China.
Sure, that makes sense.
Be an authoritarian country that's concerned for the welfare of its people and is developing itself and is a stable and strong country. That's what they want.
And I guess also another thing I've heard is they have a concern that if they want to keep the regime in power, because if it collapses entirely, they might be facing a massive refugee crisis as well.
The refugee crisis gets attention, but I think the main issue is they don't want a unified Korea with a U.S. presence.
And on that, they're certainly absolutely united with the Kim regime.
In that sense, yes. Mm-hmm.
Just one final question I have for you. I'm sure you know the 20th century, oftentimes it's been called the American century, and I think with good reason, given America's development and rise as sort of the global superpower. Some people are saying now, well, the 21st century, this is almost inevitably going to be the Chinese century. People look at their growth and just how many people there are in China and how much they still have of their native talent and resources to develop. And I'm wondering, how likely do you think that is? I mean, do you see at some point in the not too distant future China supplanting the U.S. as the world's leading economic power?
It's certainly going to be the leading economy in the not too distant future. Using normal terms, China will have the higher GDP than the United States, I think within this decade, probably within the next 5 years. And so get ready for that. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're the leading power of the world. I have views on this. Why does a country become the leading power of the world? There are many different things that come into play, but leadership usually involves doing risk and cost that other powers can't or won't do. And here, China just doesn't do this. China is not ready to do the risks and costs of international leadership. And they show this repeatedly. They want to do a win-win type of approach that doesn't cost them things. They're very focused on their own economic well-being and their own development. So it'll be that kind of an order where the great power really isn't prepared to do very much to help others, except where they get some tangible benefit for themselves. And so this is I don't think the other nations of the world will find this particularly attractive, so I'm not sure they'll be moving in that direction. The constraints on China, though, have to be taken into account. We already talked about their extensive domestic preoccupations. China is not that generous, and it's because they have all these internal preoccupations. They have to have money to deal with those sorts of things, and so they just don't give a lot of aid. And when they give something and they finance something, they want to get paid back. And this is and they do get paid back, and they work hard at this. And so one just small point here: did you know that China still receives foreign assistance? They
Really?
get about $6 billion a year in foreign assistance from various sources.
Wow.
So we're dealing with that kind of a country. But the main point I wanted to get at is that China will not be a dominant power in the world until it's stable in Asia. It's surrounded by countries in the most important areas of its periphery, on its east and its south, with whom it has poor relations. It's been working at improving relations with these countries and been free to do so for about 30 years. And they've made mediocre progress. They really haven't done very well. And so my argument is, so long as China is surrounded by these difficult countries and difficult situations, and we've already touched on North Korea, and we have South Korea, and then we have Japan, and we have Taiwan, and we have India, and we have the countries of Southeast Asia. They make progress with some, then they fall back with others. And so it's a very mixed, they're not secure there. And until they become secure in Asia, they're really not going to be able to throw their weight around easily in world affairs. And so, and this is not going to happen easily. When I talk to people about this, I said, remember European history. Some people don't remember European history or never had it, but it's important to think about it here. In Europe in the 19th century was characterized by the rise of Prussia, which eventually became Germany. And this was not like the U.S. rise, where we had oceans and friendly neighbors to the north and south. This was surrounded by countries that didn't like them. And so they needed to be very careful on how they went about unifying their country and becoming powerful. And they eventually did, but they fought a lot of wars in the process because these countries didn't like them and opposed them in various ways. And so that's where China is. They're like Prussia, trying to rise up, and they don't have a Bismarck who wants to accommodate the world. They have a very self-righteous view of themselves, which is they don't accommodate. They're out for themselves, and so this is a difficult thing for them, and it's a difficult thing for the United States because the U.S. is the big power in the region other than China.
Right. I almost wonder if that's inherent to their political system, if they can actually, if it's realistic to expect them to achieve that internal stability and having people in the region not hate them as long as they have the type of governing structure that they have.
I'm not sure, but that's a very good point. But it's the self-righteousness does have its roots in Chinese history, perhaps. Some people have told me this, but the Communist Party enhances this because they see this as part of their legitimacy. The Chinese Communist Party feels that they can't acknowledge to the people that they've made mistakes in foreign affairs. And so they never do. They never have acknowledged making a mistake in foreign affairs. And since they have a system that doesn't change or have elections where others could come and say your policies are wrong and should change, that just never happens in the Chinese system. Then you have this perpetuated view, which is they have a very effective internal security and propaganda apparatus, and all people in China generally believe that, yes, they're right in foreign affairs all the time. And it's a very peculiar sort of thing. But it's amazingly effective. And so people in China generally feel that if there's a problem with another country, it's certainly not China's fault. It's somebody else's fault.
Right.
And it's either that other country. They often blame the United States under these circumstances. And so this is so how is a government like that going to deal effectively with these very nationalistic neighbors with whom they exist? And I think it's going to be not pretty. It isn't pretty, and I think that will continue. This tension will continue.
All right. Well, with that, we will close. Robert Sutter, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We do hope you like what you heard and that you will. Last reminder, I promise, fill out that Libsyn listener survey, survey.libsyn.com/politics, guys. You got to be so sick of me saying that. I promise this is it. But anyway, survey.libsyn.com/politics, guys. And again, the URL will be in the show notes. And of course, your support is what keeps us going. We truly do appreciate it. And so if you'd like to help us out, just go to politicsguys.com/support, or you can just go to politicsguys.com and you will see the Patreon or PayPal links there in the menu. Subscribing to the show also really helps, as does sharing our episodes. That would be great. Word of mouth, of course, is the best advertising. We really do appreciate it. And we also appreciate it if you could leave a review or rating of the show on iTunes. If you want to get in touch with us, I can speak, really. If you want to get in touch with us, you know how to do it. It's mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page where you can message us, and we post stuff throughout the week, facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we are also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.